I have lived long enough to know that a house remembers you. Not in the way people do with opinions and sharp words, but in quieter ways. In the worn place on the arm of a chair where your elbow always rests. In the faint creak of a stair that seems to sigh when it hears your step. My little brick house on Rosewood Lane had known me for 42 years. It had watched me arrive as a young wife with hopeful hands and leave as a widow with steadier ones. It had held my grief gently without questions. By the time my daughter-in-law Melissa began coming around more often, the house and I had reached an understanding. We did not rush each other. Mornings were slow. Tea cooled on the table. Curtains were opened halfway, never fully, because privacy, real privacy, doesn't announce itself. It settles. I was 72 then. Old by some people's measure. But I had earned every quiet moment I kept. My son Daniel worried about me living alone. He called every Sunday, sometimes more if the news frightened him. I reassured him the way mothers always do, by softening the truth. I told him I was fine, that my knees only ached when it rained, that the neighborhood was safe, that Mrs. Halvorson next door still watched the street like a lighthouse. Melissa, however, had her own ideas about what fine looked like. She was efficient. That was the word she liked to use about herself. Efficient with schedules, efficient with opinions, efficient with other people's lives. She and Daniel had been married 6 years, and in that time, I had learned to receive her presence the way one receives strong perfume, politely but from a slight distance. At first her visits felt thoughtful. She brought groceries I hadn't asked for. She rearranged my pantry to make things easier. She commented on how dark my living room was, how outdated my locks looked, how dangerous it was for someone my age to be climbing step stools to reach the top shelves. I thanked her each time. Gratitude has always been my first language. But slowly, so slowly I almost missed it, she stopped knocking. The first time it happened, I was in the kitchen standing barefoot on the cool tiles, humming a tune I couldn't quite remember the name of. The kettle had just begun to murmur when I heard the front door open. No knock. No call of my name. Just the sound of a key turning and the door swinging wide. I froze. At my age, surprise does not arrive lightly. It startles the heart. Hello. I called, my voice steadier than I felt. It's just me, Melissa said, already halfway down the hall. I used the spare. You didn't answer your phone. I looked at the clock. It was 10 in the morning. I had been awake since 6. My phone sat on the table beside my chair, untouched. Oh, I said. Next time, dear, please knock. I might have been. In the shower, she finished, laughing lightly. Trust me, I've seen worse. Besides, you shouldn't rush to doors anyway. It's safer this way. Safer. The word landed between us like a small stone. She stayed an hour, reorganizing my mail pile, opening drawers I hadn't invited her to open, commenting on how many old letters I kept. When she left, she locked the door behind her, my door with her key. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the house relearn its silence. I told myself it was nothing. Families blur boundaries without meaning to. I had been a young wife once. I remembered thinking I knew better than my elders too. The second time she arrived while I was napping. I woke to the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, the low hum of my refrigerator interrupted again and again. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard her voice on the phone. Yes, I'm at her place, she said. Honestly, it's like a museum in here. She keeps everything. I sat up slowly, pulling my cardigan tighter around me. Melissa. I called. She startled, then laughed. Oh. You're awake. Good. I was worried you might sleep through lunch. I did not mention that I had planned to eat later. I did not mention that I had not invited her. I did not mention that she was standing in my kitchen, rearranging my life again. Instead, I asked gently, could you please knock next time? It would help me feel prepared. She sighed the way people do when patience is required of them. Margaret, she said, she rarely called me Mom, you're old. You don't need privacy the way we do. You need help. And honestly, it's easier if I just come in. Old people don't need privacy. She said it the way one states a fact like gravity or weather. I felt something shift then. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. A recognition. Till I smiled. I always smiled. Of course, I said. I just thought. You think too much, she interrupted, already moving past me. Daniel worries. I'm just doing what's best. When Daniel came by that weekend, I mentioned it lightly like an afterthought. Melissa's been dropping in, I said, pouring tea. Without knocking. He frowned. She's just trying to help, Mom. You know how she is. I nodded. I knew exactly how she was. What I did not yet know was how far she would go, or how much patience I still had left to give. Because once someone decides you no longer deserve privacy, they rarely stop at the door. And my house, faithful as it was, had begun to feel like it was holding its breath. The invasions became a pattern, subtle at first, like the slow drip of rainwater into a forgotten corner of the ceiling. One day she would appear while I was reading by the window, another day while I was dusting the shelves I had arranged just so. She would let herself in, sometimes using her key, sometimes knocking so softly it barely disturbed the curtains. Each time she smiled that self-assured, efficient smile, as if she owned not just the house but the rhythm of my days. At first I told myself I was imagining it. Perhaps she genuinely meant well. Maybe this was the way of modern families. Boundaries were fluid, privacy was optional. But the sense of being watched, of having my life curated by someone else, began to weigh on me. The soft, rhythmic creaks of the wooden floorboards under my feet now carried a tension I hadn't felt in decades. My house, which once hummed with quiet familiarity, seemed to shrink a little each time she entered. Melissa began leaving small marks of her presence. A misplaced photograph, a cushion arranged differently on my favorite armchair, my tea towels folded in a pattern that wasn't mine. Each detail, insignificant on its own, accumulated into a silent statement. She was there, shaping my space, asserting control. Then came the comments. Quiet, casual, delivered as if they were helpful observations rather than assaults on my dignity. You really shouldn't keep so many old things around, she said, picking up a stack of letters from my nightstand. It makes the house look cluttered. Daniel worries you might fall over something. I swallowed the urge to tell her that my life was not meant to be catalogued or evaluated. Instead, I nodded politely, pretending to consider her advice. Inwardly, I felt a quiet storm gather, a determination that would not yet speak aloud. One afternoon, as winter crept over the neighborhood and the first thin frost painted the edges of the windows, I returned from the grocery store to find her sitting at my dining table, leafing through my recipe binder. Melissa, I said carefully, setting my bags down, you're welcome to visit, but this binder contains my private recipes. Some are from your grandmother, some from my mother. I'd appreciate it if you didn't. Oh, Margaret, she interrupted lightly, her eyes scanning a handwritten note. Old people don't need privacy. Recipes are meant to be shared. The words were not meant to wound, they were meant to dismiss. To erase me. She smiled, leaning back as if I were simply mistaken in expecting respect. It was during these months that I noticed Daniel's absence. He had begun to avoid visiting too often, perhaps unconsciously siding with his wife, perhaps afraid of tension. I could hear Melissa's voice in the background when we spoke on the phone, dictating, directing, shaping every story he would relay to me. My son, my own boy, became a messenger, and I, the one who had raised him, was left to watch my home, my sanctuary, be quietly invaded. The breaking point came slowly in a series of small humiliations. One morning I woke to find my bathroom door ajar. My robe was hanging neatly on the towel rack. Neatly, yes, but with the sleeve inside out. My toiletries were lined up, not the gentle chaos I preferred, each tube and bottle organized by size and brand. I touched the robe and felt an unfamiliar coldness. Someone else's hands had been here. My sanctuary had been touched without permission. Another day I returned from an errand to find my living room furniture shifted again, my collection of delicate teacups rearranged by size instead of sentimental value. Melissa's voice echoed in my mind. Old people don't need privacy. She had become a presence that moved freely through the rooms, a shadow that knew no boundaries, a reminder that age, according to her, was permission to dominate. And yet I stayed silent. I smiled when she came, offered tea, thanked her for her help, all while noting every intrusion with the careful attention of a woman who had learned patience the hard way. I kept diaries, notes, mental maps of what was touched and how. Each act of trespass was catalogued in my mind, not with anger but with clarity. Because I had realized something crucial. Patience and dignity were not opposites. They were allies. And while I endured her repeated invasions, I was quietly reclaiming my strategy, measuring each action, waiting for the moment when silence would turn into power. The house had begun to breathe differently. I could feel the tension in the walls, the subtle indignation in the furniture, the way the floorboards no longer sang under her steps. They groaned as if mourning the loss of my quiet authority. I knew that if I wanted my dignity back, I would need more than polite requests. I would need a plan, a strategy built on patience, observation, and above all, lawfulness. Melissa had assumed that old age meant submission. She had assumed I would never act. And she was about to learn how wrong she was. The winter had deepened, wrapping my little house in a blanket of frost and silence. It was in that quiet that I began to think differently. Each intrusion, each dismissive comment had been logged, not in anger but with precision. I had photographs of doors left unlocked, notes about dates and times, and records of what had been moved or taken without consent. My home was no longer just a sanctuary, it had become evidence. I began speaking to people I trusted. First, my neighbor, Mrs. Halvorson, who had watched over the street for decades. She listened carefully as I described the repeated violations, nodding, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've been patient," she said. "But patience doesn't mean your rights are gone." That small affirmation felt like sunlight breaking through clouds I hadn't noticed forming. Next, I consulted a lawyer. I wanted to know, in the language of the law, what protections were mine. My lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Ms. Redding, laid it out clearly. An adult with a spare key who repeatedly enters your home without permission could be considered trespassing. There were formal letters, notices, and even restraining orders if necessary. I did not want to humiliate my family. I wanted my home and my dignity back. The law could help me do both. I began my preparations quietly, like a chess player moving pieces unseen by an opponent. I labeled each photograph, each note, and created a timeline of intrusions. I practiced speaking calmly, firmly, in case confrontation became necessary. My voice, though soft with age, carried the weight of experience. Melissa would not hear me shout. She would hear me assert, and that was far more powerful. Meanwhile, I adjusted my home subtly. Locks were replaced, windows reinforced, and spare keys removed. I moved furniture strategically so that when she entered without warning, she would notice changes immediately. Not chaotic, not aggressive, but deliberate. Each adjustment reminded me that I was still in control, even when she thought she was. I also allowed myself small acts of defiance. One evening, I baked bread, knowing she would come in the morning uninvited. I left the kitchen light off and the front door firmly locked. When she rattled the handle, she found it secured. She knocked, a little harder this time, then waited, realizing I would not rise at her summons. I watched from the window as she fumed silently in the cold. Patience, I reminded myself, was a tool. Every repeated intrusion had taught me something about her habits, her patterns, her assumptions. She believed I would never assert boundaries because I was old. She assumed silence equaled submission. That assumption was about to be corrected. The real turning point came when Daniel called unexpectedly. He had noticed Melissa's increasingly dismissive behavior toward me and, perhaps for the first time, seemed uncertain. I spoke to him gently, explaining that while I appreciated concern and help, repeated entry without consent was not acceptable. I did not accuse, I did not shame. I simply stated facts. It was then I realized. The law was my ally, yes, but so was clarity. I did not need to argue or beg. I simply needed to act calmly, methodically, and with the patience that only decades of life could teach. By the time spring arrived, the groundwork had been laid. Every invasion had been documented, every act of overreach catalogued. I had reinforced my home, informed my allies, and prepared my response. The quiet power I had cultivated in solitude was ready to emerge, not with anger but with precision. I would confront Melissa, not with shouting, not with humiliation, but with something far stronger. Undeniable truth backed by law and self-respect. She had assumed she could take what she wanted, dismissing me because of my age. But I was ready to teach her a lesson she would never forget. And when the day came, I knew that my home, which had held my life and memories for over 4 decades, would finally exhale. I would reclaim not just my physical space, but the dignity she had tried to erode. The calm before justice was no longer quiet fear. It was quiet power, and I was ready to wield it. Spring had finally arrived, painting the neighborhood in soft greens and pale blossoms. The air smelled of thawing earth and possibility, as if even the world itself acknowledged that something long overdue was about to happen. I had waited quietly, planned meticulously, and strengthened both my home and my resolve. The moment to act was not born of anger, but of a quiet insistence that dignity must be defended. The day began like any other. I brewed my tea, letting the steam rise in lazy spirals, arranging my favorite armchair near the window. Sunlight fell gently across the living room, illuminating a space I had fought to protect. Then, as I had anticipated, Melissa arrived. The familiar jingle of the front gate, the soft click of the handle, the confident stride down the hallway. She believed she would find the house as she always had. She did not. I had changed the locks. Every key she thought would open my door now met resistance. I watched from the window as her confident expression faltered, replaced by confusion, then a flicker of annoyance. She knocked, then rapped harder, calling my name in that casual, entitled tone she had used so often. I opened the door calmly, wearing a cardigan button just so, my hair neatly tucked, my posture firm. "Melissa," I said softly, "you don't have permission to enter my home without invitation. That stops today." Her smile wavered. I just, Daniel says. "I understand," I interrupted, keeping my voice steady, "but respect for my privacy is not optional. The law agrees, and so do common decency and kindness. You have crossed a boundary repeatedly. It ends now." I could see the realization dawn slowly. The invader, the woman who had dismissed me for years, was confronted not by anger but by calm certainty. My words carried weight not because they shouted, but because they were grounded in truth and law. I handed her a letter I had prepared, detailing the instances of unauthorized entry and explaining that further intrusions could lead to legal consequences. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. I did not gloat. I did not mock. My satisfaction was silent, deliberate, like a tree watching the wind shift and knowing its roots hold firm. She left shortly after without another word, the sound of the door closing behind her reverberating in the hallway like a final punctuation mark. I walked through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces, feeling my sanctuary breathe again. My furniture, my letters, my teacups, all in their proper places, all untouched by anyone else's assumptions. Later Daniel came over. He looked uneasy, as though he had only just realized the extent of his wife's overreach. I welcomed him as I always had, but I spoke firmly about boundaries and respect. I did not need to embellish. The evidence spoke for itself. In the days that followed, Melissa stopped entering without permission. Each attempted intrusion ended at the door. She had learned, in the quietest but most certain way, that age does not equal weakness, that patience does not mean submission, and that dignity, once tested, can be reclaimed with clarity, courage, and lawfulness. I found a renewed sense of peace in my home. The walls no longer held tension. The floors no longer groaned under unwelcome footsteps. My sanctuary had returned to me, intact, stronger for having been defended. And I realized something important. True justice does not need drama. It does not need shouting or humiliation. It requires only patience, strategy, and the unwavering belief that every life, every home, every moment of dignity deserves protection. Sitting in my armchair by the window, I sipped my tea and watched the garden bloom. For decades I had nurtured not just a house, but a life rich with memories, love, and quiet strength. Now that life and that home were mine again, undisturbed and serene. Melissa would remember the lesson, I knew, not because I had shouted but because I had acted with calm precision. And as for me, I finally allowed myself a long, deep sigh, a release of the tension that had built over months. The house, my faithful companion, seemed to exhale with me. Privacy had been restored, dignity reclaimed, and in the gentle rhythm of everyday life, I felt an ease that comes only when one has quietly, wisely, and firmly reclaimed what is rightfully theirs. The lesson was clear, both to those who had trespassed and to anyone watching silently. Respect is never optional, and age is never an excuse for disrespect. And in that calm, powerful truth, I found both justice and peace.